Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ready, Set, Action. You are here today with myself, Kristina Witmer, and my co host, Deborah Horwitz. And today we have a special guest, Rick Meekins. He works with various individuals to help them move their vision and create some impact. He specializes in business growth leadership. So we're looking forward to hearing more from him. So, Rick, if you would introduce yourself and then we will just throw some questions at you. Try not to stump you.
That's no funny. You should definitely try to stump me.
Okay.
Thank you guys so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited. As stated, my name is Rick Meekins. I am a growth consultant. I work with companies to help them figure out how they're going to move their organization from their current state to some future state. A little bit about me. I've been an entrepreneur for about 30 years, probably built some stuff, did some stuff when I was younger, but I would say officially about 30 years. I've been a consultant for about 19 years, run my company Epiphany for that long. And I've worked with lots and lots of different companies, from a mentorship or for consulting purpose or just even being on boards of organizations. So I've really had a fun career, I think. And I'm also a podcast host. So I love that too.
That is so cool to have all of that experience behind you and leveraging that to help small and medium-sized businesses with their growth. That's really cool. And I love the fact that we're talking podcaster to podcaster here. So that's
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 always fun.
yeah, that's
A secret language.
Yes.
exactly. So I guess the first question is, what are some of the biggest growth challenges that you see with small and medium-sized businesses, and what are they facing today? Of course, 2025 probably looks a lot different than 2024. So give us a scoop.
In my opinion, it's really foundational to people. When a lot of times when companies go into looking at, hey, how we're going to grow our company, they may not have the experience, frankly, to figure out what they really need to do, what's really going to create advantage in their marketplace. We can't put a strategy for a soccer team with a football team. It just doesn't work. We have to build the strategy that's going to be designed for the organization. And the thing that we often don't take into consideration is what it's going to cost. Even if we project, it's like, okay, we're going to do XYZ, things change. Things always change. I mean, we've seen, if you think about just in the past few years, how much chat GPT has just like flipped the script on how people do things across the board. I mean, things like that are going to happen. And so we have to really be able to be aware of these types of potential changes and do what we can to stay on top of them and make adjustments.
I think that's the trickiest part, right? Is having the mindset to be able to be agile enough to make those adjustments.
Exactly. Exactly.
Do you see
It
that
never
as
happens
a
in a straight line.
Do you see that as an impediment for some
I
leaders?
I see it as an impediment for a lot of folks because my opinion, if you're not trained in this area, in this field, it's just not something that comes natural. You say, "Okay, I'm gonna go from Georgia to California. I'm gonna get on a single road and I'm just gonna go." Where strategy says, "Hey, well, you know what? There's construction here. There's these other factors that we may weather, et cetera, the other factors." And if you're not thinking about, okay, we may need to take alternative routes, we may need to adjust, we're going to need to plan for the unpredictable, you're probably not going to be as successful as you could be. I'll put it like,
Awesome. So, my background is much more like when I came out of college and the things I started doing was more communications, PR, and marketing. So, I've had this business for about 15 years. And sometimes the nuances of the lingo and the business lingo that's very common for people is sometimes I have to dig in and make sure I understand the reality of it. But can you give me some examples like growth planning versus strategic planning? Like, what's really the difference in that? And then have you seen things change? Do things sort of go out of style or is it just the way we talk about them? Anything you can help with that?
sure. Growth planning is just what it is. Like, hey, I want to, double my revenue. I want to increase my headcount. I want to expand my market presence. I want to open up another unit, whatever that's going to be. And this is something that's kind of a tactical execution. You're just going to go out, you're just going to figure out how to do that and get that done, perhaps.
Gotcha.
When you're thinking about it, or when I think about it from a strategic perspective, it's more about where are the opportunities and how can my company be better off? Not necessarily just, hey, we've got a bigger footprint or whatever that's going to be, but how can we create a path that's going to enable us to be better at what we do? I look from the perspective of sustainability. How can we make sure that we're hanging around? I look at stability. How can we build an organization that is going to be able to maintain as the organization grows? And I look at legacy. How can we have a business that's going to really outlive us? I want to be able to sell the company at the end of the day, but if I'm not thinking legacy, then I'm not going to be able to do that. So that would be really the key difference. What I've seen or the conversations that I've had is that, especially in the last, I guess, 5 years or so, is people are saying, oh, well, things change too quickly in order to really do strategy. Years ago, we'd say, okay, we're going to have a 5-year strategy or whatever it is, and that horizon gets shorter and shorter. But the thing that we have to realize is, as we've stated before, is that things are always going to change. And so what we have to do is we have to kind of anticipate change. We don't create strategy based on the way things are right now. We anticipate strategy based on the way we expect things to be at a future horizon. And then we plan for that. And then as we get closer to that horizon, our plan or idea goes from the macro level down to the micro level. So for me, when I'm doing this, it's like, okay, I've got this goal that we want to hit in 3 years. In year one, this is what that goal is going to look like. In Q1, this is what we're going to do in order to move to that goal. At the end of Q1, we're looking to say, hey, what changed? Are there new opportunities, things that we didn't recognize or anticipate? And then we make an adjustment and we continue to move forward. And this becomes an ongoing process.
Gotcha. So even from a mindset perspective, you prepare for change that you may not know what that change is, I'm assuming, correct?
Exactly, exactly.
Okay.
I think that the key here is, we've got to have a vision for where the organizations are going to go. We have to have a mission or a purpose, why the organization exists. So those are kind of our guardrails. And then we build our strategy in a way that's going to help us achieve that vision. So if we're thinking that way, as things change, we're much more agile. We're much more able to adjust the strategy in order to continue to move towards that vision.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, and prepping for our time together today, just doing a little bit of research. From what I was reading, it sounded like most of the strategic or the growth plan implementations fail. So I'm wondering, why is that? What can leaders do to ensure that they're on the road for success?
Yeah, that's been one thing I've seen over and over, and I've had that conversation with a lot of other folks. I mean, Harvard Business Review came out with an article not too long ago, and they were saying about 70% of strategic initiatives, strategic plans fail. My observation, my opinion is that we've got to have the right team. If we don't have the right people in the right seats, we're starting with a recipe for failure. We have to have the right leadership. That leadership needs to be really engaged with what that strategy is going to look like. And he's got to have his team because no leader can do it all by himself or herself. It doesn't make sense. It takes all of us. It takes a village, if you will. The second piece to that is really when you think about the strategy in and of itself, the strategy has to fit the team. And I know I touched on this a little bit later, but we have to think about the team's capacity. We have to think about their capability. We have to make sure that we're not asking them to do things that are going to be totally outside of their beliefs and their goals. We want to have everybody on that same page and then build a strategy. Say, hey, this is where we're going. Everybody on board. Let's all row in the same direction at the same speed. And then that third piece to that is really, as I mentioned before, is I think it's really critical to have a growth leader on the team. A lot of times when we look at business transformation projects or strategic planning projects, we say, okay, let's get a project manager in place. Let's have the leadership drive that. But the project manager doesn't necessarily understand growth. Project management understands, okay, beginning, middle, end, let's push these things forward. Leadership understands, hey, this is my goal, let's go. Operations says, okay, these are the boundaries, these are the borders, this is the resources that I can apply to this. But the growth leader is going to be the single person in that organization to say, okay, let's look at the entire organization. Let's look at all the people. Let's look at the money. Let's look at the resources. Let's look at where we're going. And as we were talking about before, let's move in a way so that we're moving effectively. We're making smart decisions. We're adjusting as we need to because growth is never going to be a single flat line.
Okay. I wanted to continue on sort of like the tips for how can people be more successful in this strategic and planning. So, how do you balance that sort of short-term goals and the gains with the long-term strategies? Because I'm sure it's easy to get either distracted by something that looks like it's working and you might want to change something. Like, how do you balance that?
I've done a lot of work in innovation. And if you think about certain strategic initiatives, a lot of times what I want to do is I want to go in and basically create what we might look like as a minimum viable product. Okay, so we're going in, we're testing the market, we're testing the organization, we're testing our theory because when we're doing strategy, it's hypothesis and theory. We're testing this before we're over investing. If we over invest and something fails, we've lost time, resources, et cetera. But if we're looking at things in an iterative process and we're saying, okay, this is working, let's add to it. We're learning through this whole process. We end up with something that is probably going to be sustainable, something that's going to work better for the organization and fit into the overall strategic plan. If we do too much too fast, we're going to disrupt the card. Our team is not going to be
Mhm.
ready for whatever initiative. So, for example, you go out, you say, hey, we need a CRM system, right? So you go, you put the CRM system, you install the CRM system, you do the training, and that's done. You can kind of check that box. But the team adaptation is never going to be that fast. The team is going to take some time. They're going to make mistakes. They're not going to be comfortable. They're going to complain, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to think about strategy on both planes. If you only think about it on one plan, it's not going to work.
Yeah, we were just talking about technology and how the world changes and people change. And so there's always these moments where it needs where you step back and view the effectiveness or what the original goals are for what they are currently. So
Yes,
makes
yes,
sense.
yes.
It almost sounds like there's a component of change management in what you provide for the clients, right? I'm thinking about the role of leadership in driving successful growth and what that looks like. And it sounds like change management is a part of that. Is that something that you counsel leaders on as you're working with them, or how would you help them form their role in that process?
I think it's important before we even get started is to do a readiness assessment. We understand leadership, we understand the people on the team, we understand where they are, mindset wise. And change management, we think in terms of how people accept or are resistant to change. And so we need to understand that going into the situation. There are going to be situations where we're going to want to make a change in an organization. There are going to be people that are just dead set against that. And at that point, we have to make a decision. It's like, you know what? They've done a wonderful job to this point, but perhaps there's other organizations that they may align with better. And we have to, as leaders, we have to look from the perspective of the entire organization. You're not going to sail your boat very, very far, very fast if you've got an anchor. And so we have to know that going into the situation. If we don't know that going into the development of our strategy, we've got a recipe for failure. There's going to be a greater chance that we're just not going to make that. The other piece to that, and so we do the readiness assessment, where are you mindset wise? But one of the other things that I've seen to be more successful is to even do like a behavioral analysis. We're looking at how people work and how people approach work. And by doing so, we can start to understand where our gaps are because whenever we're doing an implementation, whenever we're looking at, we need to be able to lean on certain people with certain skill sets, certain vision capabilities, et cetera, in order to be successful. So that change management for me starts before we even write the strategy. So we create that framework, we build a strategy, we know what we're dealing with at this point, we know where all the bodies are buried, and then we go into the actual implementation of the strategy.
Cool.
Yeah, that makes total sense. You've got to lay that foundation and definitely understand where those bodies are. Yeah.
Yes, we took a dark turn here.
Let me just add one more thing, if I can, before you go with your next question, Christina. Do you come across companies that are just not ready. The CEO think they're ready to make this momentous growth strategy. Do you sometimes just have to deliver the bad news that there's too many obstacles in the way right now, or how does that work?
Good question.
That's exactly why I came up with this. It's like we get into the throes of it, we get a lot of pushback, and the leadership isn't necessarily prepared, to handle that, or the leadership is stepping away from the organization, say, oh, let's let the CFO or let's let the COO, handle this, and you guys just report back to me. And then I think the worst scenarios is where we've done massive software implementations, and so we've got the whole team using the company except the CEO. You know, it's like, we can't be successful or we can't be as successful when these types of scenarios happen. And it's not that we're not able to do an implementation, it's just that it takes a very, very long time. It's painful. It's just like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to roll off of this project. I would say that I see the opportunity a lot of times when we're developing the strategy and it gets very exciting, et cetera, et cetera. But when you've got anchors that are just dragging in the organization, we've really got to be clear with the leadership up front. Say, hey, these are the issues that we're facing. This is where the mice are burying the cheese. And we need to make decisions about that because if we don't make decisions, it's just we're going to have an infestation. That was a really great analogy.
Like another storyteller, this is good. So I'm curious about if we talk about scaling a company, can you share some of the mistakes you've seen that are pretty common? Anything that someone could learn from if they hear these mistakes happening during that process?
For sure. In a general sense, sometimes companies get into growth mode and they grow too fast. You remember Starbucks a number of years ago, they opened up all these retail outlets all over the country and they
Yep.
just grew too fast. And what
Mhm.
happens a lot of times is that companies just don't think through the infrastructure that's going to be necessary in order to support that growth. It's great to grow, and we've seen it over and over again with lots and lots of companies that have I think there was, like, some internet retailer, that grew way too fast, and all of a sudden their customer service went down the tank, and, they had delivery issues, and it was taking a
Yeah.
long time for people to get their products, and it was just a nightmare. When companies are scaling, they really need to understand, "Hey, we have to have systems. We have to have processes. These are the things that we do time and time again." We have to think through checks and balances. It's like it's one thing to get the product out the door, but something else entirely to make sure that what the customer receives is what they're expecting. If we're
Mhm.
not thinking through how to do these things, if we're not thinking through, hey, what happens when we go from 30 customers to 300 customers, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have a serious problem. You're probably not going to be successful,
Right.
or you're going to have a lot of sleepless nights.
Yeah. You made me when you mentioned Starbucks, which I remember because I love to look at the marketing and that and how things sort of explode or crumble or whatever they do. And I don't know if you'll agree with this one, but I've always thought about Krispy Kreme donuts. I'm from Maryland, so they were probably much bigger up there than maybe down in Texas where I'm at now. But, they started selling in stores and then they were never as good.
Yeah.
And I just thought you just crumble any value you had. And it's just, and I don't even really know where it's at now as a brand, but I assume when you choose to go in a store, you're accepting a certain amount of sales, balancing for other things. But when I look at the overall brand, I just thought, oh, it's kind of done as this, whatever it was. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree. I think there's definitely a quality conversation, and I am not a person that would want to sacrifice quality in the way that they're willing to do it. It's just like,
Mhm.
okay, it's great. You get a box of donuts that are sitting on the shelf at the grocery store that may be delivered every day, every other day or whatever. But, you know, those donuts at 3 o'clock are going to be horrible.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, well, just take them and pop them in the microwave for 10 seconds. We know the trick. But, it's like for me, I would never do that. I would probably be no, I wouldn't even do that. I was gonna say I was probably more inclined to sell a frozen product in the grocery store, but,
Mhm.
Krispy Kreme and again, I mean, we can say this about a lot of brands, Krispy Kreme has a reputation.
Mhm.
You're driving down the street, you see the light that says hot and fresh, you stop. You say, "Hey, we're going to Krispy Kreme right here, right now." And you have that donut experience.
Mm.
That's important. It's like the restaurant industry in general. You don't necessarily go out to a restaurant just for eating. You go out for the experience.
Yeah.
And this is what we're able to enjoy. When you start compromising on that, you hurt your brand in whatever format.
Yep, I can't get my husband to pass by a Krispy Kreme, whether it's on the road or in the grocery store. You know, he's gotta have a box one way or the other.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a loyal hardcore versus the other one.
We are
Right?
very brand loyal in our household, yes.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
So, Rick, I'm curious if there was one thing that you would tell entrepreneurs that is needed to build a successful company. Is there one thing, or what would that one thing be?
I've had this conversation a number of times in the past few weeks, ironically, is a lot of times we don't tap into the resources that are available for us that would enable us to reach further. One of the things that I've been saying to folks is we're going to go further faster together than trying to do it one on one. I'm a growth person. I'm not a CEO. I could do COO work, but I'm better if you say, hey, this is where I want to go. Okay, I'm going to help you figure out exactly where you want to go. I need people around me. I probably have ADD when it comes to implementing a plan. It's just like, oh, squirrel, 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 But as far as leading change and identifying opportunities, and I'm very, very good at that. Not everybody's going to be good at that. Other people are going to be great at running companies. Other people are going to be great at finance. Other people are going to be great at marketing. We've got to be willing. And I love that fractional work is becoming kind of the thing that people are doing. We've got to be willing to tap into those resources because we can be far more successful if we do.
Yeah.
Awesome. Just to add on to that, any specific resources or tools that you recommend, whether it's technology, software, educational materials, anything that you recommend for that? For improving growth strategies, is there anything specific you recommend people surround themselves with to improve their growth strategy mindset?
The biggest thing, I'm actually working on a tool. One of the things that I see, one of the other things I see companies doing a lot is looking from the perspective of the elephant. Okay. And so, they ask the question, what's the best way to eat an elephant? It's like one bite at a time. Don't try to swallow the whole thing. And so, this tool that I'm working on actually helps to take that strategy and break it down into that monthly and that quarterly objective so that we're not looking at the whole elephant at once. We're able to prioritize and execute these initiatives one at a time, track progress, and see that roll up into the primary strategy, into the primary goals. So if we
Mhm.
can see a smaller bite, then we can see how that rolls up, how that's impacting a long-term strategy. It makes us more comfortable as people that are actually doing that work. So that's something, I guess, plug for myself accidentally, but that's something I think is important. And
Mm.
I say that because I've seen this thing happen over and over again, where we've got a big spreadsheet or we've got a project plan or something like that. It just gets overwhelming for a company sometimes.
I think I'm gonna slip one more question in here. Oh, as a marketing agency, and we have programs for if you have a CMO or if you don't. So when you don't, we sort of enter that fractional role. Any thoughts on how you recommend those groups, whether it's fractional or in-house person between sales and marketing, and then sort of the other C-suite, like how they work together or how they communicate, or do you have any thoughts for making sure everyone's represented or something so that you can scale and everybody's on the same page? Anything come to mind for that?
I mean, it's really foundational. I think that the setting up a communication strategy, not just, and I don't want to say, just communicate better because, that's, it's like telling my kids not to eat all the Oreos. You've got to set up that framework ahead of time. These are kind of the boundaries. These are the rules. This is the checks and balances. Everybody needs to have input in what that's going to look like. If I go into a company and say, hey, this is what it's going to be, it's just like, I'm always going to get pushback on that. But if I say, hey, how are we going to make this work? Let's create this ahead of time. We're going to be in a much better position to be successful and to be able to work together. One of the cool things that came out of a recent conversation I had was actually getting people to talk about what they're looking for, what that picture looks like, and how they feel like they can contribute. And what it did is it allowed people to be authentic, and it allowed relationships to be built, built based on trust. When we as humans allow ourselves to be vulnerable to other humans, we establish trust with those folks. And so putting everybody in the room and saying, hey, this is my story is probably going to be a very, very powerful tool, as you're developing the communication strategy.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you so much, Rick. This was a very educational and interesting conversation. I think some of our viewers will really appreciate it too. So thank you for taking some time here. Thank you, Deb, always. And thank you guys for listening today. It's Ready, Set, Action. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can connect. You can watch this on LinkedIn live stream, YouTube, and Spotify podcast. And we will see you next week. Take care.
Bye, everyone.